Because of the evolving nature of Gran Turismo 7's update release, you could argue even more so than GT Sport really, it really does see a significant change in what a vehicle could have started like on day one in the game compared to now. And of course one of the biggest ways that will change is engine swaps. Back then you could technically do it, but the chance of actually winning one was pretty rare, and for many of us, myself included, I just keep on getting pretty much the same few engine swaps over and over again, and even to this day that tends to still happen. This one is wildly different now that you can do an engine swap, and if I recall correctly, I seem to remember this being a more recent addition to the engine swaps list. It is of course the Amuse aftermarket tuned version of the already very popular Z33 shape Nissan Fairlady, or as it's called here in the UK, the 350Z. Hugely popular car, very long standing car now in Gran Turismo. One of my favourite versions of this was actually only featured in Gran Turismo 3, which is the concept car, and this particular one is of course a returning face. It was one of the what I would call new school aftermarket tuners, because a whole bunch of those cars were carryovers from the older days of Gran Turismo, like the HPA Golf, the Buick Special, and they were non-premiums, so they weren't HD, they were still the PS2 era in terms of the models. For the most part, they didn't have detailed interiors, etc. And then we gradually started to see these newer premium spec cars being added. The HPA Audi TT, the Art Morrison Corvette, the Red Devil Camaro, and a variety of others, and of course this was one of these, more so in the JDM side. It's the Amuse 380 RS Super Leggera, which of course stands for super light, as it's used by Lamborghini as well. Interestingly, they add a gap in the name here for some reason. I think Super Leggera as one word looks a lot better. Maybe that's a licensing thing that Lamborghini has the copyright to. I don't know, it very well could be. In the case of this car though, it's pretty strong already. As the name suggests, 380 horsepower. The weight is very good actually, 1,370 kilos. For a modern car, I mean that doesn't sound too light, but that really is. That's very good. That's, if I recall correctly, quite a bit lighter, for example, than a just standard Mark V Golf R32. So to compare it to a hot hatch and be that much lighter is kind of a big deal. It's an even 100 grand, which is quite good for an aftermarket car, and I think the biggest thing working against the 380 RS is the S2000, because most people, when you ask them about a Muse in Gran Turismo, their mind will probably go to one of two things, depending on when you started playing Gran Turismo. If you're a more recent player, you'll probably think of the S2000 GT1, very cool looking car. If you're a bit of an older player, from say the Gran Turismo 4 days, then you might think of the Amuse Carbon R, of course the full carbon super lightweight version of the R34 Skyline. Very cool car. This one, I think for some people, you'll probably think of as well, but maybe not quite as much as the S2000. Now an interesting thing which I've noticed, because I've had many specs for these day one cars written down to review for quite some time, and then I finally get around to doing them, and it is fascinating to me to see how many of these cars have changed wildly in terms of their point level now compared to back then. And to give you some idea of how much that can change, back when I first wrote down these specs, which was, if I recall, within the first couple of months or so of this game being out, it may have even been the first couple of weeks, this car was 552 points. It's now 567, and that's without any tuning, of course beyond what they've already done to it. That's quite a big jump from 552 to 567 without doing anything to it yourself. The real game changer here though is that engine swap. It makes a colossal difference to this car, because ironically for a JDM car, and even more ironically for a tuner car, of all things, an aftermarket vehicle, you actually can't really get that much horsepower out of this thing. It kind of suffers from the Mitsubishi Evo 9 problem, where the power is fine, you can get this up around 500 horses or so-ish, but that's not that great really compared to what you'd expect for something that looks this good. I mean, you can get pretty good numbers out of a standard 350Z anyway, so aside from the visuals, maybe a bit of extra downforce, really what is the point? Now though, you can drop the Rampage engine into this one. Immediately 750 horses is what you're working with, and even if you didn't do anything else to it, that's ballistic straight out of the crate. Of course it adds a couple of $100,000 to the price of the car and the price of the build, but you could easily drop that on just fitting all the parts to the standard engine. So as long as you're not a purist and you just want it to be tremendously quick, or maybe a drift car, this has way more potential now than when it did, you know, if I'd have reviewed this, for example, on week 1 of the game being out. And of course all of this begs the question of how does this this car actually drive, with the standard 350Z already being so popular, as is the 370, and of course the newcomer, the newer shape Z as well. This is a very strong lineage. Way back in the day, also the Datsun style, massively popular in their own right. It's a fantastic lineage of cars, with each of them being wildly different for the most part to others if you compare them. What's this one like, and is it worth buying over the standard car? That to me is the most fascinating thing of all, because the answer to that has changed purely because of the engine swaps. If you'd have asked me day one, should you buy this instead of a 350Z, I would have probably said no, because there was no real advantage of doing so unless you just really like the way it looks. Yes, it is great to drive. This is really good through corners, the acceleration is strong. You'll see here, of course, against AI, but still, it can keep up with supercars, like proper supercar stuff, in some cases with quite a bit more horsepower, and that is not a bad sign. Usually, if you are going to beat the AI in a short amount of laps, you'll probably do it through the corners, for the most part. But even on the straights, this thing is keeping up with everything else aside from the Diablo GT, which if I recall was the quickest car in the world for about 5 minutes. So that's not bad at all for a Z-based tuner car with only 380 horsepower. On the other hand though, now that you can engine swap it to 750 horses, it's a huge advantage over what you could do before, and it genuinely means you go from like super sports car pace to borderline hypercar pace in Gran Turismo 7 terms. So I think it's a fantastic kind of rise to fame story thanks to an engine swap, and it's one of those occasions where the swap really does redefine what a car is capable of. It's certainly a good example of making something that's already a really strong base even better. So ultimately I'd love to hear the thoughts of those down below. Maybe you were already using this prior to the engine swaps, maybe you found it was a really great car for you, for circuit racing for example. I could definitely see that, drop the weight even more, put on some better tyres. It's pretty much already ready to go for 600 points. That's it for my thoughts on the Amuse 380 RS. I'll see you in future with more day one vehicle reviews, as well as the newer ones to the franchise, and I'll see you next time with more. But for now, thanks for watching.